Good morning, everyone. We appreciate everybody's efforts today. We know that there are some that are with kids or other reasons aren't able to join us today, and we certainly acknowledge that. We also know that our colleague Beth Holbrook is en route and certainly left in enough time, but is enjoying the freeway at this moment. So why don't you stand and join us in repeating the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next, we'll have our safety minute from Dave Karras.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to say that the roadway worker protection class that goes on every Wednesday morning conducted today at 0700 hours, and so we had our 15 construction trucks out here and the people that do work in or around our right-of-way here getting their roadway worker protection training. So training continued. And you think I'm going to give you some snow precaution safety? I'm not. I'm going completely to the other side and giving you the cybersecurity message this morning. There's an email that was sent around last week that there have been a rash of fake invoices. Interesting that at the end of the year that hackers and people will send out fake invoices with compromising accounts. The emails contain links to a very convincing login page, which prompts you for your email and password. The objective is to attack and gather your login information and compromise your account. This was sent by one of our 3 IT cybersecurity professionals, and so we're very aware of things that are trying to get into the UTA system, and we warn our people to be vigilant. Safety always, cybersecurity always also. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dave. We'll next go to our public comment. Bob, do we have anybody today?
We do not have any comments in person or over the internet.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'll entertain a motion for approval of our board minutes from January 30th, 2019.
I so moved.
Second, any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion passes. We'll next go to our agency report with Steve Meyer.
Thank you, Chair. Wanted to brief in person. I am blessed to be here in Utah and see Utah's finest snow. Yeah, this is great. Something we don't see too much of down in Arizona. So we have a slide for me. There we go. So I wanted to give you a grant update. We talked a little bit about this last week, and this shows a summary of the discretionary grants. In 2018, we were awarded $45.8 million in discretionary grants. So these are our initiatives set up by the Federal Transit Administration and other parts of US DOT that focus on things that they want to accomplish. And then we look at those grant opportunities and see if there's opportunities to match things that we want to do, that we want to accomplish. So, for example, the Tiger Grant, a first and last mile program, a great project working with multiple cities and counties in our service district along the Wasatch Front, looking at making those connections to our transit system. So we're installing handicap ramps on sidewalks at intersections to allow people to more easily access our area. In Farmington, a section of sidewalk that allows some good connections for pedestrians to get to our bus routes and to the new high school there. Bike lanes, bike facilities at our stations, bus stop improvements, things like that. A couple pedestrian overpasses, one in Salt Lake, one in Provo. And it's a great program. It's going to be a multi-year project, and we're very fortunate, and our team is doing a great job communicating and working with all the communities. There's a lot of local participation, local dollars that the communities had that they matched up. It's part of a goal of over $100 million with the Wasatch Front Regional Council and MAG to make these first and last mile improvements and remove barriers to alternative transportation, walking, biking, and transit. The electric bus, the Federal Transit Administration low and no emission.
I'm sorry, where are they in that processes? Are they
We're
in construction?
Yeah,
or-
we've constructed. We have multiple years, 4 or 5 years worth of construction,
Okay.
and so we're working through those. We had a pretty productive first year last year.
Sorry.
The NOLO buses, working with Park City and Rocky Mountain Power, gave us a grant as well. We didn't get as much money as we requested. We sometimes talk about how we could scale that grant down, so if they don't give us an award, we can still get some useful things out of it. And so that one, I think, will probably help fund some Park City electric buses. And then CMAC is Congestion Management Air Quality, STP, Service Transportation Program, and TAP, what's TAP stand for? Transportation Alternatives or something like that. First and last mile. So we apply with Wasatch Front. It gets evaluated by our peers within the local jurisdictions. A technical group evaluates those, and we get awarded. So we've received funding for a Sandy TOD parking structure that will take some of our surface parking and turn it into structure, so it allows greater TOD development around that site. We've been pushing over the last few years to get some funding for locomotive overhauls, which we needed to do anyway, but we've got incremental funding that'll take us to the next level of emission reduction on our locomotives, and then just operational support funding. We've also received funding for a bus facilities grant, $13.6 million for our new Depot District Service Center, our new bus facility downtown, and these other grants with helping the Disability Council. We talked about the American Dream competition. We did get $30,000 to take us to that phase. We weren't successful getting that grant, but we learned a lot about this program, and we're looking for other opportunities to continue on with that project. So these, just an example of what we accomplished last year. We got another
That
slide.
grant for the Depot District, how close will that get us to completion of that renovation that we need?
So we've had some other grants with that, and with local funds, we have a financial plan. Yeah, right now we're estimating about $35 million bond issue in 2020.
Okay, thank you.
But we'll continue to apply for other opportunities to help close that gap. Grant update, or these are grants that we have applied for that we're still waiting on decisions. And as I talked about last week, as the shutdown ended, FTA is working really hard to get documents awarded, grants awarded. So we've got money in there for the Ogden BRT, a request in for that. It's not, that's again a scalable one. We've worked with a program with the local communities in the state. We've got pockets of money from Weber County and Ogden and us, and then we would look towards this amount as the federal that would match the local dollars on that. We're looking at the Utah State VW settlement funds to increase our electric vehicle fleet. We put in a proposal for 27 buses and then 8 buses with in concert with Park City. That would be that Park City connector. And then this e-voucher pilot software program, small project again to tie the service providers together that are providing different types of service, so we can coordinate that and provide vouchers for them. And then upcoming potential grants, what we see on the horizon right now. Again, we go through a cycle every year. I think this year we're looking at funding for 2025 for the CMAC, STP, and TAP. So we have a list of projects we put in for there. Bus facilities grants, they're saying that's coming out again. We'll look at what's appropriate, what their focus is, and what projects we have in our capital plan that might match up with that. And then the build grant, we've talked about, we'll work regionally because we don't want to necessarily be in competition with other entities around the states. We often coordinate with UDOT and other entities that might want to submit for this, but we're looking at potentially double track on front runner, some assistance for core route implementation, for some other major projects. And then we anticipate another no emission grant project, and we'd look at that for some more additional electric buses.
Steve, what would be the timing of the build grants? I mean, are they ongoing? Would there be just sort of a window in a year or two?
Mm-hmm. We've typically seen them annually. It depends on what Congress appropriates in the program, and so it is potentially funded. Right now, those funds are on hold. If the budget gets appropriated and it continues to be in there, we would see that. Every year, they seem to tend to have a different focus. One year, it was a lot on ports. Other years have been a lot on bridges. Transit has always gotten some portion of that. But again, we try to look at what those themes are and how within the state, what kind of projects. It may be UTA projects, it may be a UDOT project, but try to see what's best. That's it. I think that's my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. We acknowledge our presence of our colleague Beth, and thank you. We know you've been doing your best, and commend you for getting here safely. Steve, anything on pre-procurement that we should be aware of?
Sorry, I don't believe we have anything on, do we? Pardon me? Okay. Yeah, we've got a replacement of 5 police vehicles. So that's just normal vehicle procurement of that we'll see here.
And are those replacements or are they additions?
I think they are replacements.
Okay.
Yeah. As you can imagine, we put a lot of miles on those.
Well, one question I had is, and this is more just fundamental, like it seems like when one department replaces, all the departments have the same vehicle. Is that because of the state contract, or do you choose a particular type of vehicle that is more suitable to service in our right-of-ways? Or I just wondered how you get to the vehicle.
We do try to look at state contracts and other contracts and then see what kind of vehicles those are. Do they meet our needs? More with the police department, we do have some specific requirements for those. And as you can imagine, with our maintenance away service vehicles, same thing. Our service vehicle or our supervisors may need an SUV or something like that, whereas the maintenance away folks need a pickup. So we are looking at that, but typically there are some statewide contracts, or we'll do, if we know long term we've got some bigger purchases, we'll do a multi-year.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Let's go to our discussion items, and first we're going to talk about reserves and debt stabilization fund. That's quite the name.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So we're going to have a discussion about reserves, and what we'll do in the presentation today is we'll talk about overall general guidance from Government Finance Officers Association. Then we'll look at what other transit agencies are doing, and then we'll look at our requirements and how we're complying with those requirements. So first we'll start with Government Finance Officers best practice. There's actually some documents that are publicly available on what best practice is, and so I'm going to summarize those. And there's really 2 ways to look at it. One, most governments have general funds, like cities, counties, that sort of thing. Then they'll have enterprise funds, utilities. Well, we're really an enterprise fund, so I'm just giving the general fund part to you so you can see the distinction between general fund and enterprise funds. So generally you start with a minimum of 2 months of operating revenue and expense. But there's a lot of things to consider. You know, are your revenues predictable? Are your expenditures volatile? Do you have exposure to one-time outlays? Are you in an earthquake zone? You know, and what's the probability of something like that? Those kind of things. You know, what kind of reserve do you want to have, and how it might affect your bond ratings? You know, some of the rating agencies give you credit if you have a higher reserve. And then you also look at, are some of the reserves that you have set aside for certain things? So you might say we have a project that we are wanting to save money for, and so we're putting those monies aside. They're committed or assigned to a specific purpose. So you even have to go in within those reserves and say, do we want to count those or not when you do the calculations for the 2 months, or do you need more than 2 months? But again, for general fund, GFOA talks about a 2-month minimum. Enterprise funds, we're not going anywhere. I'm sorry, my clicker's not going anywhere. I'm stuck. Here we go. Thank you. So enterprise funds, they talk about working capital, enterprise funds, and you think about the flow of funds into a general fund, you're thinking taxes, generally fees, things that are fairly steady. Enterprise funds, typically you're talking about a water system where wintertime revenues can be fairly low, summertime revenues can be fairly high, or a sewer system where it's a little more even. So enterprise funds are different just because of the flows. So GFOA best practice says, well, you should start thinking with a 90-day baseline, and they recommend a 45-day minimum. But there's also other factors to consider in an enterprise fund. There's a few more in an enterprise fund. It has to do with your cash cycles. So you think of our cash cycle, 70% of our money comes from sales tax. We get that once a month, about the 22nd of the month. So within the month, we have cash flow cycles that we have to pay attention to. Think about, are there large customers? Well, we do have some large customers, but relative to sales tax, they're not as large when you think about where our money comes from. And then we have the federal government, of course, which we had to withstand the 35-day closure of the federal government, and we couldn't draw down funds during that period. You think about your service. Some utilities' service demand varies throughout the year. Ours is fairly steady. Do you have control over rates and revenues? If you do have control over that, you probably need less of a working capital, but if you don't, like we don't, you probably need a little bit more. You have to look at the infrastructure assets. How old are they? Are they being maintained in good condition? If they're relatively new and good condition, you probably need a little bit less. If they're older, think of some of the transit systems that have been around for 100 years, and you've probably read some materials where their backlog is significant, and to make their improvements, they have to shut down whole lines to do the work that needs to be done. So, again, we're relatively blessed because our rail system's fairly young. Volatility of expenses. Do you have expenses that can change a lot? And then do you have control over those expenses? If you needed to, could you slow down your expenditures? And then you look at, do you have separate reserve targets for operating and capital? So lots of things to consider when you think about what the appropriate level of reserves might be in an enterprise fund.
Bob, can I ask a question along
Sure.
the line? I was trying to think of sort of what become unexpected expenses for the agency, and a lot of equipment was probably bought at the same time frame. But if you started having significant maintenance issues in multiple units or something, I could see that being, and maybe you're going to get into this, as you calculate those reserves, you take that into account, like what the age of some of those big potential repair items could be? Or?
Yeah, so when we get to the reserve, we do that as we look forward with budgeting.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've calculated that into how we came up with our reserves. The policies that we have in effect now have been in effect for several years. And so it may be time to go in and take a look at that and ask ourselves these questions. You know, what's our exposure to large one-time expense, earthquake, some sort of natural disaster, things of that nature.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Bob, can you tell me kind of what the definition of, what defines a volatile expense? Like, how is that defined? What does that mean? Is it that one-time earthquake issue, perhaps, or is it something else?
It's more that it varies. It might be seasonal. You know, think again of the water system where your expenses would be higher in the summertime. You know, again, ours don't vary a whole lot. The service stays the same. Our expenses change at a change day if we add more service. So ours are relatively consistent. Whereas other enterprises, it's just not.
Which then, of course, diminishes the volatility aspect.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So that's the best practice guidance from the Government Finance Officers Association. What do other transit agencies do? It is all over the board. So it's really interesting. Brad Armstrong did this research for us. TriMet up in Portland, they said 2.5 months of operating expense. Denver, RTD, they said 3 months. San Jose, they're at 15% or less than 2 months. And then you get into the Sound Transits that say, well, we want 2 months of operating expense. Then we've got an $88 million emergency loss reserve. And, you know, think about the Seattle area. They do have a few earthquakes up there. And so they've put that loss reserve in. And then they put in $300 million capital replacement reserve. So thinking about, you know, do they have capital needs that they're worried about that they may have to just go out and buy some capital to keep the system running. Again, to me, that's connected a little bit to their thought of an earthquake possibility. And then another approach to this is RTA in Cleveland, where you've got 1 month of operating expense plus a fuel expense, 10% of the prior year, a fuel expense plus 25% of the prior year accrual of compensated absences. I've never seen that one before, but that's an interesting one. Plus 10%. Yeah, that's a personnel cost. So they've accrued the compensated absences, sick leave, vacation, and they're just saying we're going to set aside 25%. I assume that would be if they have workforce retirements. And then they've got prior health care cost of 10%, and then plus $5 million for the rolling stock. That's quite a calculation.
So just to clarify, the rolling stock is probably another way to say their capital replacement, or are they defining that differently?
Rolling stock probably means buses. So there's different ways to apply best practices. And we're a mixture of these, as you probably already know. So let me go through what we've established over the years. And there is a handout. I think you've got that. It'll maybe be a little bit easier to read than the slide here. I've divided the reserves into 3 different groupings. This first grouping is really the working capital, the board reserves. And then there's 2 other reserves. One is required by bond covenants, which is on the next slide, as well as the early debt retirement account, which is also on the next slide. So there's 5 reserves. We've got a service stabilization fund that was established in 2008, right at the beginning of the recession, saying that we want to make sure that we have funds set aside that if we see a significant decrease in revenues, that we have time to operate the system and make decisions, just because it takes time. You know, we make changes at change day. There's a public process we have to go through if we're going to, and lots of study has to go into that. So the intent is about 6 months. Give us 6 months to identify that something has happened. whether it's significant, and what changes do we have to make. The second one is the working capital reserve. That's the one that's really set aside to handle the cash flow needs within our month or throughout the year. So we get our sales tax approximately the 22nd of the month. That's about 70% of our revenues. So this working capital reserve allows us to take care of payroll, payables. Then we get our money. So our cash flows come down as the month comes along, spikes up around the 22nd, and then comes back down. Other effects in there, obviously, are the federal money that we draw down, about $6.5 million a month from the federal government, and then any capital projects. So within that is also, we spend money for capital. We try to draw it down within a day or two, if it's a significant number. So it handles that, and it also has to address the, no, I'm sorry, I'm going someplace I don't need to. We place money aside every month for our debt service payments. It goes to a trustee. That's not shown on here because they're not really reserve funds. They're principal and interest funds. That's where I was heading. And so as we think about cash flow, though, we're putting those monies aside every month, and then every June and December is when the payments go out. But those are handled by the trustee. So, and then we've got a risk contingency fund where...
Do we submit those monthly to the trustee? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, they draw them down from our account.
Oh, just automatically?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we make sure we agree on how much should come down every month. And then there's a calculation in the 6th month for any interest that's been earned.
Okay.
And so they'll reduce how much they draw in June and December based upon how much interest we've earned.
Okay.
There's also a risk contingency fund. We are self-insured. It's part of the executive limitations. I should have said the same thing on the working capital reserve. That was set by executive limitations policy back in 2014. That was a revision. The calculation wasn't as straightforward. We just changed it to a straight 9 1/3% to make it easier for everyone to understand. And the risk contingency also has been in place for many years, as has the working capital reserve. Then in 2014, we added 2 reserves, one for fuel and one for parts. The concern was that fuel can vary significantly from what we may have budgeted, and so we wanted to budget more closely than we had been. We'd been budgeting at $3.30 per gallon, and fuel prices dropped significantly right about then. So we wanted to follow the price in our budgeting, but also have funds ready in case the fuel went back up. So even though we're doing our best to forecast using the EIA projections, who knows, right? And you asked last week, Kent, about our fuel price. We paid $1.80 last month, and we budgeted $2.50. So it's a good start to the year. But if you remember from our prior financial reports, we were in the $2.40 range. December went to $1.90, and then January was $1.80. Then there's also a parts reserve. We had the same concern as we're looking at our rail system, in particular, that there could be very expensive parts that, we're talking $500,000 on some of these, that we don't really want to carry that because it's infrequent. You don't want to carry the parts, spend the money. So we didn't want to budget for that either. So we said, instead of budgeting for what could happen, let's budget for what we think will happen, and then let's set this money aside in case that we do have one large unexpected expense, or the other reason we can access this is if there's what we call a campaign where we're seeing that something fails in our system and we just need to replace them all at one time. And so again, that could be a large unknown expense also.
How often have we dipped into that particular parts reserve?
We have not dipped into it since we established it. We also have not increased. It gets funded if the budget for parts is If the actual comes in less than our budget, that difference we place into this reserve. And we've been exceeding that. I haven't looked at the 2018 to see if we need to, how we came out on parts, but that's how it gets funded. It can go up to $6 million.
All right, thank you.
So I have a question in terms of large parts, if I'm understanding you correctly. So like we have in our rail system, we have those comets that are older, and obviously keeping parts would be even a challenge. How does that play into that when they're in service, but yet they're an older vehicle?
Yeah, Steve, you want to let me talk about engines. We were thinking locomotive engines when we set this up, that if you blew an engine in a locomotive and it couldn't be repaired, that's pretty expensive.
So I think that's consistent with other parts, though. So as the chair was mentioning early, as you're going on, and if you had a component failure that was systemic through your entire fleet, that's when you would incur an unplanned expense. So all these reserves are unplanned expenses, right? So we're budgeting in our operation and maintenance for normal replacement, and what we're foreseeing, we're in the midst of light rail overhauls. We are looking at those comets and exploring what to do there. We're in some locomotive engine overhauls. So this is if something were unexpected happen. The expected expenses we're trying to budget for. So in our 5-year, as we start looking at longer range operating, our TFP, our financial plan, we're trying to anticipate those things. So this would be if we really guessed poorly, because and just think about what we would normally do if we saw an unexpected expense, fuel or something else. We're going to adjust our budgets, and we may defer some other expenses. We may push a capital project down the road in order to cover our budgets. I'll go back, Bob, in your experience, in your time here, how often have we dipped into any of these reserves?
I'm not aware of any time we have.
Yeah, and I'm not as well. So we have these, and you think about it, and you look at that. That's in total, $139 million that we're setting aside that we're keeping for unexpected events. And potentially, if you had something significant, you could consider moving money out of, or a lot of issues. Different of these reserves could be applicable to that. So you could pool some of the money between the different reserves to attack a specific issue.
An example that we saw yesterday, Jenna and I were up at Warm Springs, and they're having to rebuild an entire engine on a locomotive because of a failure. So maybe that's covered by the normal budget because it doesn't happen that often. Mm-hmm. But as we looked at that, they were having to tear it apart, rebuild the entire thing. It might be that this contingency or reserve could be used to cover that, because that affected expense. But we actually peered right into the torn down motor. The other thing is on the comets, we've got 25, evidently we've got 25 cars around and only 14 are being used.
Correct.
So we're using the other 11 as parts houses. And but of course that will run out eventually because we will have used all the usable parts. And so that was one of the questions that we raised yesterday in our discussions up there at Front Runner. What's the expense of replacing those, because they're really no longer, parts are no longer available for those cars?
Well, in fact, they are. They are still being used. There's cars similar to that, I think, still being used in New Jersey Transit, where we got those from. So, it's like our vehicles. Think of our ST-100s, the first light rail vehicles they built and we got in 1999 put into service. They don't make that vehicle anymore. So, but there's a community, there's a transit community that have that, and we work together with them and we talk about what are those major components. Do we each need to have one of those major components, or could San Diego keep one of those? And we all know that, hey, if Utah gets in a position, they have it, we could buy it from them. We have some parts that they could potentially use. And then we pool our efforts together. What are we seeing our needs are? And through purchasing, buying them together, so you're getting a larger quantity, because you're right. You start talking about these one-off parts, it's very expensive. But now if you can show a fabricator that there's a larger inventory of this, and you get agencies working together, then there's that fabricator may see a commitment. Oh, I'll build some inventory. I'll start setting up. I can be ready for you when you do an overhaul. So that's kind of the discussion we're having on the Comet Car. Are we going to replace those? There's issues with that. Is it a new vehicle or used? We have some access agreements with FTA about how we access those cars versus the rest of our fleet, that we'd have to modify our access at the platforms. And I think, staff, as I've talked to them, they're kind of trending towards, well, maybe we overhaul those. We would have the potential, and our platforms are built out to have 2 Comets on our fleet, and our platforms are set up for that. So we're going to continue to evaluate that. We do have peak load capacity needs where we could use a second car.
So one question I have, and I always think about this from my city days, and what the sort of limits of fund balance are, and obviously each of these reserves sort of have a specific purpose. But if I take the bond reserve out, I mean, you're really running at about 20% of budget, right, on your reserves?
Yeah, so the 52.6 million here is about 18.9% of our operating budget, the 2018 operating budget, or about 69 days.
Yeah.
So we're within the GFOA best practice. What we may want to do is, do we want to rethink how we come up with our reserve balances? What do we want to have them at, and then how do we get there? So what I tried to do on this slide was just put the ones together that in my mind relate to the GFOA best practice.
Sure. Okay.
And also to show that we're in compliance with all the board policy on those reserves.
How did they come up with the 5% and the 9 1/3%?
Yeah, so the 9 1/3%.
I mean, between the two, it's just less than 15% of.
Right. So the working capital reserve, the prior executive limitations policy, and I won't get it all, but it was essentially we want 1 month of operating expense plus 1%.
Okay. Thank you.
It was longer than that. It was a full paragraph to get there.
But thank you for the Reader's Digest version of that.
Yeah, and then the 5%, I wasn't here at the time. I think that was a estimate of what kind of money would you need to buffer for that 6-month period.
Okay.
And an estimate of how much could revenues decline, and you'd still have time to react to that.
All right. Thank you.
So head over to a couple of other reserves we have. The next one is the Debt Service Reserve Fund. These are the ones that are required by our senior subordinate debt. And so those funds are set aside at the trustee, and they're there in case for some reason we would ever fail to make a payment. We never have failed to make a payment. And our trustee checks this every year to make sure that we have the appropriate amount in there. And so we're at the 39.8 million that's required. And then the one that I think is also in the title of this presentation is the Debt Service Reserve and Rate Stabilization Fund. I just call it the Early Debt Retirement Fund because that was the intent of setting this up, is that we would take the funds saved through some of our refundings. And we used to have variable rate debt, and we would budget at 3.6%, but the variable rate debt was less than 0.5%. And so the board at the time, this was back in 2012, actually before I got here, said, we ought to take that and put it aside and use it to reduce our debt, or in case, it's variable rate debt, in case the rate spiked up more than what we'd budgeted, that there were funds. Those who were around in 2008 may remember variable rate debt spiked with the failure of Lehman Brothers and some of those folks. And where I was at the time, the city I worked, there were concerns whether you could even get someone to continue on, and would you have to go ahead and come up with however much money to pay off those bonds? So we worked through a strategy to get out of the variable rate debt and get in fixed rate debt at times when it made sense to do so. And so we've been putting the savings from the refundings. It's mainly been the 2015 refunding.
And it says the board ended the policy on January 22nd, 2014. So right now, that's because all of our bond debt is fixed rate. Is that correct? Or
That's correct. All of our debt is fixed rate now. And so what the policy says, it's really intended to be used for early debt retirement or to fund a new bond reserve or for any other use the board determines. It's always up to the board how you want to use those funds. Right now, the intent is that will build up to about $98 million in 2022. And as we've talked about, you may or may not want to go ahead and retire debt in 2022. If our interest rates are above 5%, is it the best use of those funds to retire 5% debt when you could be earning 6 or 7? Just an example. Or when we talk about the new debt in 2020 for the depot district, you may want to look at that and say, well, what can we issue that debt for? What interest rate, and what's our evaluation of what we could earn on the $98 million? So you have options with that particular reserve.
And is there sort of even a hybrid of that you would say, could you use this reserve rather than bond and take whatever those bond payments were to go to this? I guess what you would be foregoing is the potential of early retirement, right?
Right. And so there's decisions to be made, and they don't have to be made today. There are points where when we get into 2020 and you're thinking about the depot district and whatever that amount needs to be, whether it's $35 million or something less than that, do you want to consider using this? The thing I usually advise people is cash is hard to get. Be careful spending it.
This is the current balance of the reserve, the
Correct.
$47 million.
Uh-huh.
About how much is being added if we're trying to get to $98 million in the next 3 years or 4 years? Are we putting in?
Sure. So we're putting in about $24 million this year in the budget. Next year it's about 17 or 18 million. Then it declines.
All right.
We should show you the before and after graph of the refunding. What happened before the refunding, our debt service in 2018 spiked up. It was a steep climb in 1 year and then leveled off. And what we did with the refunding is we did a smoothing of that. And it cost us a little bit in net present value to do that, but we still had net present values of $77 million and actual savings closer to $100 million. So that, and again, we're in compliance with the bondholders as well as your policy on this particular reserve too. So open to questions.
So there's the general sort of, I can't even remember the first slide you had, what it's called, but the national standards or the
best practices.
Best practice standards. What does the special district law require? I mean, what's the state actual requirement for special districts?
I don't know that there is a requirement. I'd have to go look at that. I know on cities there's some limitations.
Yeah, that's why I was asking. I knew in cities they have.
I don't know that there's a limitation. And even within cities, and again, I'm not familiar with Utah cities, and I'll ask the question back, is there difference between a general fund versus an enterprise fund?
There
I
is.
anticipate there is.
Yeah, and also capital. You can set funds out that don't keep you, take it outside the limit of reserves.
So I can look at that. I don't recall seeing one, but there may be.
Okay. Any other questions for Bob? I would just say that let's keep the dialogue going. I think, when I look at the dates of some of those policies, and I think they've been prudent, it's served the agency well, but I think as we look at cash forecasting and needs and, equipment repairs and replacements, it would be nice to see, do those policies serve us well, or are there, other ways we'd want to look at it? Because sometimes when you just have unused cash sitting around and other things you could or need to do, are they better spent? And I think we just have to have that conversation.
Right, and then you need to have the conversation on financial policy about one-time revenues coming in and how are those going to get used, and there's probably other financial policies we need to wrap into this whole discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that presentation. Our item number B, we're going to hold off till our meeting next week, and also I would fail to recognize that we have an employee that we were going to honor and recognize, and due to storm and other issues, we're going to hold that off till the 13th as well. We'll next go to a discussion on our capital projects implementation process with Mary Delaretto. Mary, how are you?
Morning. So a couple of things I'm going to talk about today. First is our capital project implementation process. So this process basically shows how a project goes from the planning phase to the implementation phase at UTA. And also, one of the responsibilities of the advisory board is to recommend, approve and recommend capital projects for final adoption by the board. So we've also developed a policy to go with this process to show where we think it might make sense for the advisory board to do that approval, and where we think it makes sense for you folks to have your approvals. We're going to present this at the February 20th meeting to the advisory board, so I'd love any input you have on this process and see if it makes sense or not. So first, I'll define what we mean by a capital project for the purposes of this policy. It would mean any project what would provide a new asset by expanding transit service, such as a new light rail line and extending a rail line, a new bus rapid transit line, or a project that involves the construction of a new facility, like a maintenance building or a parking structure, something like that. It excludes any transit-oriented development projects because there's a separate policy to address those. And then also any state of good repair projects. We don't include that as in this policy because those are just ongoing maintenance things that we have to do. So looking at the flow chart here, the blue represents the planning phase.
Can I ask a question on
Sure.
sort of maintenance ongoing? Is there ever sort of a decision point, even though it's existing stuff, where you say, you know what, we should just we should just not do this thing and discontinue it? And I realize that most of the stuff is sort of there, but is there some kind of point where you have that conversation, like, is this really worth replacing, or should we do something different?
Sure. And I think an example sometimes is some of our bus fleet. We'll talk about, should we keep these buses longer, do some overhauls, incur some additional expenses, or should we replace those buses? We've had there's been some model years that haven't served us as well. And so the bus operating groups and their maintenance work identifies that and and they're measuring that performance as the vehicle goes along, and they'll make those decisions. You'll see over time they tend to prefer other year model buses, and they defer those, and then if we can meet the requirements for years and miles, we'll retire those particular early. So I think we would look at other assets in a similar fashion.
If maybe, so, and I'm not proposing this, but like if there's you have a stop on the light rail line and that stop just never gets used, it never worked out, was a good idea, but didn't, and needs a lot of capital repair. Is there a part where you would then take that and say, maybe we should just spend our money putting it over here where there seems to be a lot more need for it than where we placed it?
Thankfully, we haven't had that situation yet.
And I'd like to be off the board when we do it, but, but I just wondered, is there a time frame where we think about that?
So where you would see that, like Mary's talking about, you wouldn't see that in necessarily this project. Well, if we were building a new station, you would see this, right? That would be a new major capital facility. For some of these other ones, you'll just see it in the budgeting process. We'd identify it in our capital budget for that year. We'd likely be talking to you about it in advance of that. It would be something like that would be a significant enough issue that we would certainly be talking to you in the service planning aspect of it as well. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. And I know that they're putting together a 5-year SGR plan too, that I think they're going to come to you in a few weeks to present that state of good repair and how we think over the 5 years what needs to be repaired. So that might be a good question to ask them. So in the planning phase, that's, I don't know if Laura's here today, but I think if she is, might be part of her presentation about the planning phase. But basically, we take projects, what the MPOs have developed in the long-range plan, in association with the communities and UDOT and UTA, and then they generate a list of projects. Then we take one of those projects and we'll develop what we call a project definition. So we would identify the purpose and the need for that project. What problem are we trying to solve? We'll also look at what would be the benefits of that project. We do just order of magnitude cost estimates, and then funding potential. Like, would this be eligible for a small starts, do we think? Or would this be eligible for some type of grant or other source of funding? And then we put together a project definition. And at that phase, it's not shown on the diagram here, but at that phase is when we think we just want to present that for informational purposes to both the board and the advisory board. And we did that to the last advisory board meeting. We presented the Point of the Mountain project. So something at that phase, that's what we would be sending just for informational purposes. And then after that, we would go into the development phase, and that's where we would do the alternatives analysis. So this was a little bit hard for us to put together because sometimes it's linear, but sometimes these things are done concurrently. We're not necessarily doing one of these items at a time. For example, the alternatives analysis sometimes is a standalone document where we look at the different alternatives that would satisfy the purposes and needs for the project. And then a locally preferred alternative is adopted by the local communities. Sometimes it's a standalone document, and sometimes we actually do it during the environmental phase, the environmental impact statement or environmental assessment. So at some point in there is when we adopt the LPA. And then as we're doing the environmental assessment, we're also doing conceptual engineering to see where exactly would this alignment go, get a better refinement on the cost, and then look for funding partners that could help pay for this and put together a funding plan. So we kind of put the advisory board as a big block here because sometime in this process we think we'll have enough information to go to them with what the LPA is, what the benefits of the project are, how we think it would be paid for, and get their approval to continue, I guess they would recommend it to you guys for approval. We wanted to wait till we had enough information for them to make that decision, but we didn't want to get too far down the line all the way to an environmental decision before we ask them for their approval. So we're trying to be a little bit flexible here. So as soon as we have enough of that information, we would come to the advisory board.
Mary, I had a quick question, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding this, and then I had the question at the end. So really what we're talking about today with the capital development is that anything that is integrated into the community, in other words, needs community input, needs to go through this process, correct? And then my question is if we are obviously working with our MPOs to know whatever the area is that we're dealing with has this on their long-range plan. What if, for instance, there is a situation that suddenly comes up that is not on the long-range plan? And how much community engagement does that impact, and does it make changes in the planning phase, thus making it slightly different in the development phase? Because let's say, for instance, a locally preferred option changes, or like with Point of the Mountain, it was just here's two analyses, either one of those type of a scenario. How does that work?
Okay, so Point of the Mountain, as an example, is on the long-range plan, but it's way out in phase 3, and it's along our right-of-way. So because this is different, we're moving it up because of community requests. We're moving that up in the plan. So depending on what the LPA comes out to be, we would have to go back to the MPOs and have the long-range plan modified to have that planning. As part of the adoption of the LPA, in addition to the municipalities, the MPA would also have to adopt that locally preferred alternative.
So, in other words, what you're saying is that based on whatever analysis that we come up with, whether it's one that's preferred or the other, we are obviously engaging with our community partners throughout this whole entire process, and that's kind of where you're talking about that one doesn't happen and then the other type of scenario.
Right. It's more of all this is happening at the same time.
Mary, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in my last job when we wanted to modify something on the long-range plan, I mean, you basically have to, in addition to convincing staffs that it's a worthwhile modification, it goes to the COG and has a moment of public hearing before the actual regional council adopts it or amends the plan.
Yes.
I mean, it was like about a 5 or 6 month process by the time something got added.
Yeah, it depends on the timing. If you can get in right when they're going to have their meetings, it works better. But
Yeah. But it's not something you just do in a month or two.
And since the plan is fiscally constrained, you'd have to identify what that funding is going to be as well.
In
at
order
that time.
to even move it. Yeah.
I think to Trustee Holbrook's point, there is a lot of public involvement, right? That we can't jump the queue, move something up, move something around without going through that process, as the chair talked about, and that is a very public process. So we're in there, working with our partners to identify what those long-term needs are, getting them in the long-range plan. As those advance, they're advancing and updating those plans annually, so the public sees these projects, if they're paying attention to these long-range plans, for quite a few years before it moves further into this process.
So once the advisory board approves and recommends the project, it would go to the board here for your approval, and then the environmental document would be completed and a decision document issued. If it's a local environmental process, the executive director would sign both the document and the decision document. If it's federal, then FTA would also be involved in that decision process. After that point, we would move to the funding. And again, this isn't all linear either. We do the funding at the same time we're finishing the environmental sometimes. But we would put together memorandums of agreement with our funding partners for how this would be paid for. I assume most of them would be over $200,000, so we'd come to the board for that approval. Sometimes we have funding agreements even before the construction portion of it, because funding partners, they also help us pay for the studies a lot of times. So sometimes we just amend those agreements to add more funds. And then we could begin the procurement process once funding is identified, hiring our designers, our contractors, procuring any equipment and vehicles. Again, getting board approval for any contracts over 200,000, and then we could start the design. And once we're done, we go through activation and implement the project, turn it over to operations. So, any questions on that?
Just a quick confirmation. So once we get to the implementation phase, that means the design and the location and everything else is fixed, the funding's in place, and then that's actual shovels in the ground.
Right,
and so,
we're starting to build
our
the
community
project.
partners obviously are, well, by that time they're very excited.
You would hope.
Thanks.
So we, like, as I said.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So what if they're not excited? Like occasionally when you put in a rail line, businesses and others who, are aware it's going in, once the equipment shows up, they're a little bit animated. Is there, I realize this is more the approval process, but is there something in there that just acknowledges that interaction, or is that just part of the considered part of the construction box, I guess?
So we have public outreach throughout the project, and even during construction, we do a lot of that. We have weekly or monthly updates that we send to the local businesses and residents so they know if there's going to be a utility interruption or a road close. So we try to keep, our PR folks are really good about keeping the public engaged and aware. And of course, there's always people who are not going to be happy about things, but we try to do our best to keep them aware and know what's happening. So
I think you always have those discussions. Provo, Orem, BRT was like that. The UVX project, as that was going, we talked about it for years. We'd had over 120 meetings, something like that. And then still, when the orange or the yellow equipment shows up out there, people are shocked and surprised that
Something's going on.
something is happening here. Yeah. And I think UDOT sees that. Your experience, or trustee on the UDOT commission would have similar experience. So we do spend that time. We recognize that's likely to happen, so we're going to up our level of engagement at that point, just educate people again about it. We really are trying to improve our practices. I think the MPOs are as well with their long-range plan. You've seen greater opportunities for participation, greater visibility, even through the Chamber of Commerce and other entities to make those long range plans visible, and we have to continue to work at that, because that is the opportunity for the public to really engage and weigh in on those projects. And as you get further along, that's reflective in what we've shown here of where the advisory board weighs in. We want to do that with enough information that they can feel comfortable that they're making an informed decision, but not so far along that we've expended large amounts of dollars on a process that we're expecting a go, no-go decision, and they feel like, well, this is already baked. We want to hit that sweet spot when it's appropriate time. Now, before that, most of those people on the advisory board have probably seen it through the long-range plan development process. There should be no real surprise if you continue to be aware of what those processes are.
I realize this is probably more the MPO area, and I haven't had the experience with MAG, so they may do it even a little better. And I don't mean this in a derogatory way toward WFRC. I remember them having sort of a regional open house, and we had, this is coming from my prior job, we said, well, we're willing to advertise to the public, and sort of the reaction was, well, we only want the local officials and the staffs there, and I say that from the standpoint of, and I think you nailed it, if we're sort of picking general alignments or general directions, and we're looking for the public input, and our world is just the transit part of that plan. I don't know, is there a way in that process that we, can announce to the public to come look at it? Because it really, as you get going down the road, I mean, that ship really has left. not too far past that. I don't know if there's something that we can do that's complementary to what they're doing. And they do a good job. I just think that it would be greater to engage the public at that point.
Yeah, I think that's something we should continue to look at, because there are people that are looking just at us or just at UDOT, and they're specifically concerned about our projects, our transit projects. So if we're a conduit for that information, using our social media and our website to announce that gets the people that are concerned about transit.
Often, well, not often, but sometimes are not even aware that the local COGs have been involved.
Yeah.
And they're really looking to UDOT or UTA in our instance, and the information that we provide as opposed to, say, MAG or WFRC. I had a question, Mary. I see where the advisory board approves early on, but in the funding and procurement part, there's no reference to going back to the advisory board for continued information flow or approval. I'm not sure at that point if they've approved it early on, then I'm not sure that we're looking for approval in the funding and procurement side. But is there a time when we would go back and inform them of continued status?
Yeah, we'd be happy to go back, and I think I mentioned we don't have it on here now, but we, right after the blue and before the green, that's the point we want to come to them for informational purposes, and anywhere else in the process where they'd like it, we could add that in.
Don't be surprised if the advisory board isn't wanting to have final approval at every step of the way.
Okay.
I like the way it's presented here, but we probably ought not be surprised if on the 20th they're wanting a box with their name in it throughout.
Okay, and we'll do what they want, so.
Well, and candidly, I think that, just referencing that, I think they do only meet, roughly, yeah, exactly. And so that, I think balancing the realistic utilizations, I think your point, though, is well made, that there should be an ongoing, communication, hey, just an update on X location that you approved way back in whatever date, that we now have full funding, or we now have the environmental done, or whatever the, all the grant applications are in, et cetera. That's probably a good practice, I think, moving forward. But I think realistically, I think that can counterbalance some of that, maybe that desire to be engaged in every level of it when they don't really have the bandwidth with their meeting structures, at least. Right. I just had one other question, and this is in regards to the Ogden BRT specifically. So that project still has one more open house, as I understand it, and their final comments are due February 15th.
The Ogden?
The Ogden BRT. And now,
I think you might be thinking of the Ogden on-board process, because the BRT maybe we're done with that public process. We're trying to get the FONSI now, finding no significant impact from FTA before they maybe close again. So
you're right. Maybe that is what I'm thinking. So, okay, thanks. And so my question about that portion of that, because that has been significantly done prior to this new governance structure, but I think it would be really good to have, once all of those levels are done, I know part of that with the Ogden for the federal side of that, which obviously has been delayed due to the government shutdown, but maybe there's an update that we could have when we are at that stage, and we could incorporate that into the advisory board as well.
I think next week we were planning on giving an update to the board here, so we'd love to do it to the advisory board as well the following week.
Great, thank you.
I wonder on the financial side, just from a practical standpoint, and I think Kent's right. They'll ask, and that's the question of what does the statute says their role. But part of their role is budgeting and capital, and I think what we could do and think about how to do this, because we want to be responsive to their question, but could as part of either the capital or the budget part, say here's where the projects are in their funding or procurement stage or something of that nature, so that it is clear to them, but maybe
Yeah, I
not
think
so
it's
much
more
of the approval standpoint.
Yes, I think if they give approval in the early stages, then it's simply information flow from then on.
Yeah,
Here's the status of what you have approved.
and maybe it's something you just provide them as part of their meeting, as an information-only item. And,
Right.
if they have questions, certainly we can
Yeah.
respond. But
Right, I would agree with that.
They will, yeah, they will see it during the annual budgeting process. We have our capital list. We describe what those projects are, and especially on expansion type projects. That's usually a big part of our discussion.
And the intent is for the capital plan that we present for them to approve to have a detailed funding plan in that. This is how it will be paid for. So they'll know exactly where the money will be coming from when they approve it. Okay, any other, should I move on to the next item?
sure, I'm assuming that's capital budget update.
Yeah.
So, yeah, unless there's any other questions to the prior thing, so.
So a few weeks ago, Bob presented the financial dashboard and mentioned that we were putting together capital project budget dashboard, and this is our first attempt at putting something together. So we just want to present it to you, get input, see if it works for you, if we need to change things, if you want more information. So this was as of the end of 2018. We put this together. The pie chart that there shows how the total out of the total budget, capital budget of about $236 million, how much was spent that during the year, how much the yellow shows obligated. So those are things like items we had to order but aren't in yet, or contracts that we have that aren't completed yet, but they may be multi-year contracts. And then the pinkish color represents what was not spent on the capital projects. Below that, the little line graph shows how much is spent. That would be each month it'd be updated to show what's spent over the year. And then the orange above that shows the expended plus obligated together. And then on the right side, we're showing that we just picked all the projects that are over $2 million to look at, and then lumped down below, the bottom two lines are all the rest of the state of good repair projects. I think, let's say 54, and then all the rest of the capital projects, another 77. So we just lumped them together because they're a lot smaller. And then we show the total budget for the project, and then it shows how much was spent and obligated for the, this would be updated monthly as well. And then we're trying to figure out how to show which ones are over budget and which ones maybe have a schedule issue. This is just, we didn't really go to ask all the project managers about the schedule. This is just as an example, but so as we do it monthly though, we'll get those updated from the project managers about schedule and budget. So you could see some of them are over budget, but it's just because they're over obligated in the most cases. And then some of them, like the UDOT one near the bottom, that's just because the budget wasn't set right. UDOT is actually reimbursing us for all of that work. So the budget just needed to be adjusted, and we didn't get around to that last year. So any questions on this? Suggestions?
A couple that I have, the on schedule, like the red, yellow, green works for me, because anytime I look at one of those engineer charts about where they are, it's painful for me. But I guess I'm more on a budget guy. I'd almost rather see the actual numbers of where they are and get a sense of what the scope of the budget is, to give me a sense of like percentage of budget remaining. And, I've also thought a little bit, and I call it like a budget amendment process. And as we do, and going forward, and maybe we have to look at this as a policy, and we certainly would want to work with Bob and have a process such that once we've approved a project, if the budget is either going to change or, basically, even if it's shifting from one to the other, I'd like, especially if it's over this 200,000 piece, or maybe there's some threshold where just administratively you can adjust. If you had to go out and buy and put in a section of sidewalk, I don't know that I care about that as much. But if you're changing scope or delaying, it seems like that ought to come back to us and have a process that, is fair. And we don't want to hold things up dramatically, but I think we would want to have a conversation about what it was that we approved and what's changed. And I don't know if we can somehow think about that process, and maybe it exists and we just haven't experienced it yet. But
So that's going to be my next slide.
Oh, sorry.
How we're going to do that.
But let me just speak to that. Bob brought that to our executive team meeting Tuesday, and he's so excited about the budget process. He just wants it to be a 12
Kansas
process.
Day.
Yeah, those two things.
Kansas Day?
Yeah, we missed Kansas Day, and there were some really good brownies associated with it.
But I appreciate what you're saying, and that I completely agree. If we're making transitions between projects, for example, if something, what you see here on airport, there's a huge budget, not very much expenditure. Well, we budgeted for the full amount, and we got, we're told by the airport, you're not starting until the new terminal opens, so we can close that existing parking garage, close the access to it, and then you can start your construction. There was some material procurement. We would have, under your scenario, we would have come back to you and said, oh, we don't need all those dollars. At that point, we'll have a 5-year capital plan that you've looked at and approved, so you could see, well, we could move those dollars, and maybe we have another project that's ready to go. We could advance that and still preserve those dollars and know in the long range, in the 5-year plan, that there are dollars for that to be completed. That's been the concern of the project managers, right? If I don't lock in the full amount, I'm not guaranteed that it's there next year when I need it. I want to be able to give the project managers that comfort that we're aware, we understand what's going on. We can have a multi-year plan that's approved, that we're working with Bob's financial plan. We know that the cash flow is there. We know that can flex. We know revenues can tweak up and down. Well, we can be flexible with these projects. Another one, for example, the SD X1XO 100-160 rehab overhaul. That is really dependent on parts, right? And like we talked about earlier, they don't make that part anymore. They don't make that air conditioner unit that fits exactly on that vehicle anymore. So we're looking in the marketplace, and then what's the lead time on getting that? So there's a lot of discussion with the project team and procurement about how to get those parts. When do we need them? When do we need to start the air conditioner program or whatever program it is? So when's the right time? When will those parts be there? So it's a lot of timing issues. There's a lot of things in play. But with a board like you are here, spending the time on it, meeting weekly, we can be flexible that way. We're going to get better utilization of those funds. And my goal would be to not have 37% unspent at the end of the year. Those are capital dollars that you've assigned. Those are dollars that the public has provided us to use. We need to be using those as efficiently as possible. Bob's going to invest them and make 2% on them. That's not, that's fine. But inflation oftentimes is higher than that. And we're going to lose potentially purchasing value. We need to be as efficient. We need to be a little more flexible as to how we approach these capital projects.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, please.
I just had another question, and Mary, you might be on your next slide. This might be it. But one of the things that I think would be valuable for me as well is to not just know that it's on schedule, but to know what the anticipated completion dates are. I think that that is really helpful for the airport scenario that the executive director just mentioned. It explains that exactly to me. Here's why there's so much money budgeted and yet not expended. And there's a reason behind why that occurred. An anticipated completion date can kind of help to navigate that, because obviously we're going to be dealing over multiple years budget-wise. And so having that defined, that I think is very beneficial. So I don't know if that's on your next one, but
No, nope. And I mean, that's something, I guess I don't know how busy you want this to be or how much information you want, but I could put in the on schedule, I could put the anticipated completion date right in that box and then have green or yellow on it. And then it was the percent spent you wanted to see?
I mean, it just would be nice to know, and I realize it is on the bottom, but when you get into millions, it's not quite working well on the, what is that, the y-axis or? X-axis, I knew I got it wrong. But, you know, I'd almost just as soon see airport project $25 million, and that just gives you a sense of both scope, and then, you know, if you see on there that the completion date is, I don't know, 2022 or 24, or I'm just trying to remember.
2021?
Yeah. Then you know, like, it just gives you a sense of, like, this is not tomorrow.
So the 5-year budget will hopefully take care of the costing things, but then that might screw up by showing the schedule. So what we're anticipating, the 5-year budget would not be showing for the airport $23 million next year. It'd show maybe $10 million or whatever we think we're going to spend.
For this current year.
Right. And so if you want the current year and the total budget, we could.
Well, maybe something like that also speaks to, you know, the project manager who's like, no, this isn't 10 million, you know, remember I've got to spend more next year and the year after. And I think that helps us realize this is a multi-year budget process.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the difficulties we're having is, you know, we want to make sure we know the projects and estimated spending. Well, then the budget process is an annual process. And as Steve was saying, projects move. And what you thought you were going to spend in 1 year could be different, but it's not because the project's off. It's just the timing of the expenditures were off. So we're having those discussions internally. How do we accomplish the 5-year kind of goal of letting the project managers manage the project well, instead of, you know, December 31st it stops until you have a new budget. You've got this gap of time where you can't really do a whole lot as a project manager and still stay within our required budgeting process.
I could even see a scenario where, you know, you think you're on, and then all of a sudden something comes up, and it's clear it's not going to happen this year, and it's April, May, and say, you know what, we're really ready to go on this project. We weren't going to do it till next year just because of constraints. Let's just swap these two out. And then, you know, you just come back to us and say, it's a revenue neutral thing, but this project's ready to go. It was designed, and it just needed to be replaced. Kent, you look like you had a question.
Well, just a comment on the editing. Because we understand these are those over 2 million, eliminate the zeros there and just put 2.5, 5, 7.5, et cetera.
Made that note when he pointed out that, yes, that's a good, thank you. Okay, so I guess my next slide is, so there are projects that go over budget or some that are under budget. Do I turn this? Okay, so we're working on right now a policy of how we're going to get projects onto the, you know, approved to move forward. And so you'll see that in a couple weeks. I'm not sure when that's coming, Bob, but you'll see that coming, where it shows how we have the initial project request and then a detailed project request and then how they get approved. But then these two forms are well, this one form is 2 pages, what we've drafted to help you guys understand when we want to change a project budget. So we would have the requester, the project manager, submit the project to, you know, we have a Laserfish program now that we're trying to use. So they would submit their request. They'd explain why, you know, they'd put what the original budget was, what the new budget would be, and then if the project timeline changed at all, they'd put any changes to the start date or completion date. And then they would put the reason for the amendment, and then that would get submitted, and I would be the first one to see it as the Director of Capital Projects. I'd look at their request. I'd see, okay, where could this money come from? Can we move something forward? Can we move something back? See how that would get funded. Then I'd go meet. Then it would go to Bob, CFO, to figure out. Oh, yep, we have money here that we could use, or what kind of other sources of funding there may be. Sometimes it's local funding that we could get for it as well. And then it would go to the executive team meeting, and then they would discuss it there to see if they want to approve it. If Steve signs off that it gets approved, then it would come to the board for approval. So that's the process we're thinking about putting in place. Does that kind of meet your needs, what you're looking for? Yep, I
To
think
go
I
back
can.
to the previous page, I just had a quick question on the time extension portion of that. If it's a revenue neutral, would they still have to do that if it just extends the time?
I think we would still want to know if they wanted to extend the project as well, because if it's going to take, go into another year, that would affect the whole 5-year budget of when it would be funded. So.
For me, I think it would be a good, we may find that we have to tweak it or something, but I think it fundamentally gets to where I was hoping for. And thanks for having it one slide later so that I felt like I was smart. And then you got here, so.
Trying to be responsive. She just worked on it.
Mary's just that good. So.
One of the other things we'll want to think about is the formal budget amendment process. I don't know that you want to be amending the budget every week. So we're anticipating that these would be not quite the formal budget amendment. We would gather them and then have a formal budget amendment for these and other things that we know about this year.
Okay.
That makes sense, since you are, obviously the next page has all of these signature requirements and all the other stuff, so that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Item E, we're going to postpone till the 13th as well, and that brings us to our next meeting, which will actually be the 13th. Is there any other items that I'm overlooking? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Motion to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned.